Hi, Andrew from SACS, and welcome to video number 5 in our 6-video sequence on psychology of power. So far what we've dealt with in this sequence, we've talked about what is power, we've talked about what causes people to acquire power, given some examples of people who've risen to power, neuroscience of power, what happens between the ears, where does power come from, and in particular in relation to personality. Values and power is what this one's about, and in the next video we'll talk about how to avoid the negatives of power at work. Just to talk about values and power. Values are something that will affect people's behaviours, but not as much as personality. I know that people generally think that values are everything, but the difference between values and personality is something that has a very strong genetic component to it. Some will estimate as high as 70% of personality is genetically determined. And we do know, for instance, that if you have identical twins that are separated at birth and never meet each other, their correlations in personality measures, you give them a personality measure to complete, this person over here, this person over here, and then you correlate them. The correlations you get between identical twins separated at birth are much higher than the correlations you get between non-identical twins that grow up in the same family. So there have been decades of twin studies done on this sort of stuff and a whole bunch of gene sequencing kind of research. And we know that there is a strong genetic streak in personality. It's kind of like how we're hardwired to respond to things. Do we like risk? Are we hardworking? Are we emotionally stable? Do we like people, or do we prefer to be private? All of that stuff, very heavily genetically determined. Values, on the other hand, are learned in the course of life, and SACS has been involved in a lot of primary research on values. And we do know that values change as you age. So your personality, if you're an extrovert at 3 years of age, it's highly likely that you're going to be an extrovert at 50 years of age. Multiple studies have demonstrated that. Values, on the other hand, are learned, and so they will change, but they do affect behavior, but not as strongly as personality. So if I am an intrinsically angry person, that's much more likely to influence my behaviors than if I've learned to moderate that anger. Now, the moderating of anger being learned is a really good thing because it means that I have a kind of a self-management effect there. But in this video, we're going to talk specifically about values. The first value we're going to talk about here is power seeking. And you'll see that we have 10 Schwartz values along the bottom of this diagram. And these 10 Schwartz values are from the Schwartz perspective on values. Shalom Schwartz being one of the world's most important researchers on the topic of values. Now, the important thing to understand is that values are goals. And in fact, researchers call them trans-situational goals. So they're goals that apply in a lot of different situations. So what this diagram is showing you is that it's showing you 10 Schwartz values and the degree to which you can predict these values from somebody's personality. And this is a piece of research that SACS undertook. And what we found was that the degree to which a person's personality affects their values varies. So there are some values that are not very well predicted from personality, which suggests that they're largely learned. If a value is highly predicted by personality, and in the last video I explained a little bit more about the personality characteristics that predict the tendency to seek power, then if it's highly determined by personality, then it's kind of got a stronger genetic streak, if you want to put it that way. And you'll notice that of all the values that are predicted by personality, power is the one that's most affected by personality. So about 54% of the variance in power is predicted by personality. In the last video, I showed you that things like the tendency to be a little dishonest and a little bit striving, and a little bit forceful and those sorts of things, not surprisingly, relate to power seeking. Power seeking, in this case, literally the desire to dominate either people or resources. If you look at the things that are not heavily dominated by personality, things like tradition, and that's perhaps not surprising because the degree to which people are traditional is affected by where they grow up. So, for instance, Australians, we have a relatively short history, and so we tend not to be so traditional. Whereas, for instance, if you went to, I don't know, somewhere in Spain where they had decades, perhaps even centuries of traditions, people will tend to be more traditional in the way that they view life. If a person is a power seeker, that is something that's unlikely to change because a person's personality doesn't change massively in the course of their life. This is the Schwartz values, so conservation, self-enhancement, openness to change, and self-transcendent. They're in effect 4 quadrants of values, but you'll notice that this person's extremely high on power seeking, the 83rd percentile. And so we measure this for clients, and this tells us that this person is highly power seeking. They're also highly achievement seeking, and what that means is that they're ambitious to get ahead. So this paints the picture of somebody who is a power seeker, which means that they want authority over money and resources, but they're also really ambitious. Now, the upside of all of that is drive, because this person is likely to be hyper motivated to get ahead in life. The downside, of course, is how they might interact with other people. So just to explain this piece of research, this was again based on thousands of people, and we had measured people's personality. This is the Hexaco model of personality with the 6 factors, and we'd also measured the 10 Schwartz values. But as well as that, we had people complete a measure of interpersonal counterproductive work behaviours. Let me explain what interpersonal counterproductive work behaviours means. It's the degree to which I'm likely to bully, harass, ignore, snub other people. There are 2 forms of counterproductive work behaviours. Interpersonal means stuff that I do to other human beings. The other alternative is organisational counterproductive work behaviour. And that's where I might do bad things like, for instance, take sick days when I'm not really sick, or say bad things about my employer, or ignore their safety rules, or those sorts of things. What we find is that when people are high in one form of counterproductive work behaviours, they're more likely to be high in the other. But you do get cases where people are really kind to their colleagues, but terrible to the organisation, or vice versa. What this study is asking is, can we predict whether a person is likely to be bad to other people, bullying and harassing and that sort of stuff, based on their personality and values? And what we discover is the answer is yes, we can predict that. We're predicting that with about 40% accuracy. That's what that 0.399 means. The adjusted R squared says that that's close to 40% accuracy in predicting bad interpersonal behaviours by values and personality. And we find that the best predictors are in fact sociability. That means if I like people, that I'm less likely to do bad things to them. Modesty. If a person is highly modest, then they're less likely to do bad things to them. That's what the negative beta weights mean. The bigger the beta weight, the more accurate it is as a predictor of interpersonal counterproductive work behaviours. Conformity is a value. Conformity is the degree to which a person believes that rules are important and is inclined to follow rules. Personality in terms of fairness is a good predictor of whether a person is likely to do bad things. The more fair-minded they are, the less likely it is that they will do bad stuff to their colleagues. And forgiveness. What that means is that when a person is low in forgiveness, then they are more likely to do bad things to their colleagues. Perhaps not surprisingly, it's a degree of grudge carrying. Now, the thing that's really noticeable here, the bulk of what we're seeing here are in fact personality characteristics. And that's why I said earlier on that personality is a bigger driver of bad behaviours than values are, and so that's why you should psych test for personality on the way in to any organisation. But if we look at values, what we did is the same thing, but we measured total counterproductive work behaviours in this case, and that means interpersonal counterproductive work behaviours, doing bad stuff to human beings, and organisational counterproductive work behaviours, doing bad things to the employer. And we asked the question about whether values could predict them. The first thing you'll see is that if you look at the total adjusted R squared, you're talking about 18% rather than close to 40% in the other diagram. This result, by the way, was highly significant, which means that it's not due to chance. And so what it means is that a person's values will influence whether they do bad stuff to their colleagues, just nowhere near as much as personality does. Personality, being genetic, is a much bigger driver of negative behaviours. But if we look at the values that do contribute to the tendency to do bad things to the organisation or to colleagues, what we see is that the strongest one is conformity, and people who are high in conformity tend to do less bad stuff. That's what the negative beta weight means. But look at this. High power seeking means that people are more likely to do bad things to the organisation and to their colleagues. Benevolence, what that means is the value of being kind and helpful and wanting to be able to be relied on. People who are like that are less likely to do bad things to their colleagues. And interestingly, self-direction. When people are high in self-direction, they're also likely to do bad things to the colleagues or the organisation, slightly more likely. And I guess what's going on there is that if you're self-directed, you're saying, well, look, those are the rules, but who cares? I want to do what I want to do. So we've introduced you to the idea of nature and nurture, and I've explained that personality is largely nature and values is largely nurture. Cognitive ability or intelligence is also largely nature, and things like skills and experience and so forth are largely nurture. And in the next video, where we talk about how to avoid the negatives of power at work, we'll explain a lot more about what kinds of things we think you should do to recruit the right people, but also promote the right people. And if you are promoting somebody, and let's say there's an indication that they may change their behaviours based on acquiring power, we also suggest some training suggestions or coaching suggestions that could help that to be managed more effectively. So the next video is about avoiding the negatives of power at work. Click on the link near this video to join us.